The whole philosophy around listen to your land, that the way we build our homes is a mirror of our perceived relationship with nature. And our homes today are sort of an embodiment of separation. And so my first step would be to find nature, to search for it, search for the elements. Where does the sun rise and fall? How does that affect the quality of light in your place? Small, tiny curiosities. How does the wind blow? And then zoom out from your house to your garden, from your garden to your neighborhood, to your watershed, to your whole ecoregion, and just be curious about that. And the more we connect back with nature, the more likely we are to save it, is my motto. And hope.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on this episode, I'm joined by French architect Jo Petroni about her embrace of ecological design thinking as the foundation for her firm, Permarchitecture. I find that many folks have widely varying definitions and interpretations of permaculture. Some people I've talked to have said it's about knowing what plants go well together. Others will say it's about creating food forests. And one of my favorites is that permaculture is a revolution disguised as gardening. For the episode today, our guest Jo Petroni talks about designing ecological human habitats by using a systems perspective that looks at the land and the community as a whole. Jo hails from France and was trained as a classical architect and followed in her father's footsteps in the profession. Her coming-of-age story parallels her embrace of holistic design, and her message of listening to the land is one that strikes me deeply. That's because so often we inherit critical design decisions, things like where home sites are located, from people that do not have this perspective and rather make decisions based on things like the shortest distance to existing utilities, orientation of a road, or where a clearing may currently exist. These kinds of decisions can have lasting impacts for decades, which is why Jo's approach to design is so striking. Jo, I'm really excited to talk with you today. And I thought a really fun way to get into a conversation is to tell us where you are right now, because we have a lot of distance in between us.
Yes. Hi, from France, the south of France. Thank you for having me, Neil. This is a lovely chat that we're going to have, I'm pretty sure.
It's a real treat to have people from different locations outside of the United States. We're a little heavy on the podcast with United States folks, but that's we can do something about that. And so it's a pleasure.
Well, here I am, all the way from the middle of nowhere, France. I live at the foothills of a medieval village, 1200 medieval village, with rolling hills and a beautiful watershed and deer and pheasants.
Did you grow up in the town or the village that you're in now?
Absolutely not. I'm a digital nomad, but I did come back to France after a long detour. I was born in the Yvelines, in a tiny village in the north, close to Paris. And then I traveled quite a lot and now came back to France in the past years.
Well, let's start off there, because I'm curious how you ended up in a really small village. There might be
a good parallel here, because I grew up in the city and now find myself in a village of 1,000 people on an island. But I want to, before we get into professional work and things like that, I know that you have influences from your family and your dad and work in architecture. But how about we dial it back into, what's a good place to really begin this conversation?
Well, I am an architect. I don't know what to be anything else. I've always been an architect. I grew up in countryside France, little, bourgeois village, very tidy and well kept, but full of nature, in close to Paris. And my parents decided to go back to Romania, which they had fled in communist times, with this enthusiastic will to rebuild and remake after the fall of communism. And so I became the French girl in a big Romanian city in the capital, in Bucharest. I grew up as a sort of outsider, which certainly influenced the way I see the world even today.
Why is that?
Well, because you have this perspective on everything from the outside, and it's very helpful. It helps you be, have critical thinking about stuff. And it doesn't come naturally, especially when you've, been and belonged to a place for a long time. Whereas when you're uprooted, it has its perks, but you also feel like you don't belong anywhere. And after I finished architecture school, we started traveling quite a lot, and we've been digital nomads ever since. Long stays in various places. It has been very fun, and we've learned a lot. And throughout that process, we realized that we're looking for more remote places, isolated nature. But you would call them isolated, but we would call them more connected, because what we're looking for is not less humans, is more nature and more being with the elements. And so that came naturally. And so here we are now in the middle of nowhere in the south of France.
You said that you had always been an architect. And you told me before this that your father was an architect. What's the link there? Is that something that you just grew up thinking, I'm going to be an architect, or I am an architect? Were you designing from a very young age?
I never really considered being anything else other than an architect, I think. And there's this, family legend where I was tiny, maybe 4 years old, on my father's construction site, barely any walls, no roofs, and showing people around, waving my hands up in the air at the spaces to be, and saying, "Look, beautiful." So I was small enough to not be able to say beautiful, but I was big enough to, imagine the spaces and say that they were nice. I learned my trade alongside my father, and I went to architecture school like a good student and worked in architecture for quite a long time, and gradually grew disenchanted with the way we were doing architecture. And I felt there was something missing, and I didn't really put my finger on it yet. And so just kept going. And then I think there's two sort of pivotal moments happened. One of them is that as my father was gradually retiring, he bought a piece of land with a small orchard and a tiny house in the countryside. He wanted to become a gentleman farmer. He had been really a city boy all his life, but that's what he wanted to do. And so I went to help him get set up. And I got with me Bill Mollison's permaculture book. And so what happened was that I spent 2 months, maybe, late spring, early summer, in nature doing light physical labor, reading Bill Mollison, looking at that piece of land with new eyes through the book, and meditating. And it just completely changed the way I see a place. And the second pivotal moment was when my dad died. And I got over it like you do on a personal level. But then about maybe a couple of months after he died, I had a professional question. And my instinct was to call my dad and ask him for advice and talk it through with him, as I had done all my life. And there was this deep moment of loss. Like your anchor got cut. But it was also a moment of freedom. Like you don't know where you're going, but you're like, now the path is yours to take in a way. Because all of that thinking and rummaging that I had been doing about architecture was now fully mine. Like it was fully my responsibility to understand it. And I was under my own influence and nobody else's. And so that's sort of how it started. And I've been doing it ever since.
I have this fascination with design as a non-designer, but I look at some of my favorite designers and they go through a process of embodiment that it's not a head practice for them, that it's very much just dropping in and using intuition to guide them. And it's so interesting to hear your story from designing as a young child and then going into academia and architecture school, which is, above the shoulders. To then hearing you say, I had to move past a thinking and toiling. Do you have an experience around how you design? Do you feel like you design from school and knowledge and thinking, or is it from a different place?
Well, the architect Juhani Palasma says it very well, and I'm probably not quoting him right, in maybe The Eyes of the Skin, which is a fantastic book to read. He says that architects envision lives and build spaces around them. And there's this hope that architecture can make you have a better life and shape you into a better human. But what I feel is that there's also the question of introspection around what does that even mean? Like, how do you define better? How do you define life? How do you define, so there's all of these questions that at the bottom of it are quite spiritual and massively instinctive as well. Like the rest of it, building, the walls, yes, that's above the shoulders, but all of the profound basic questions of why you're doing that, it's an act of shaping future, right? So you need to know what future you're planning on shaping. So you can go, it turtles all the way down from here. You can go as deep and esoteric as you want, questioning something as simple as a house. Because basically a house has very simple elements. There's always a cooking space, a sleeping space, living space. Now we've added a workspace. But it's an easy puzzle, you'd think. And yet there's infinite possibilities of matching them up into houses.
How did the Permaculture 1 book in Bill Mollison and David Holmgren's writing, what was the shift there? You talk about moving into your own practice. Can you give a snapshot of what that was before to really what came after?
Yeah, in hindsight, it's easy to see, but it was a sort of long-winded process. Basically, what I see the difference between the way I used to do architecture and I was taught to do architecture and the way I'm trying to shape my architecture work today is the difference between the linear Cartesian input versus output engineering type of thinking and systems thinking approach and complexity thinking. The architects sort of think they have all the answers, and there's a straight line of calculations from one point to the other. Whereas permaculture as a philosophy is a shift from that thinking to zooming out and seeing all the elements as a whole and yourself as a whole. And what it goes deeper to is humans are not separate from nature. There are one element in this whole system that is our natural system. And whether they'd like to admit it or not. And so this shift in thinking has not happened yet in most professions, in most areas of thinking. But the shift is happening. The regenerative world is a testament to that. It's proof that we're changing the way we think ourselves in nature. And so basically, what I'm trying to do is embody that into a new architecture, right? I know it sounds grand, but that's a basic question.
Is there any influences within the architecture field that you feel like you're getting inspiration from to start to really blend these two disciplines together?
One of the very first architectural systems thinkers was Christopher Alexander and the pattern language, which effectively broke apart the linear architectural thinking and made a system out of it. And his thinking of patterns led to pattern languages in IT, in code. And I'm not really sure what the lineage is with complexity thinking and systems thinking. And they probably went parallel, but there's a lot of theoretical background around that. And Christopher Alexander is one of the foremost thinkers in that field.
Yeah, Christopher Alexander is one of those mathematicians turned architects that the thing that I really try to take away from that work is seeing that the whole. And I recognized when I first was hearing the word whole and holism, I had a real hard time thinking my way into that. And it's the through line that has really helped me is to understand how you can bring an aliveness to a community or to a home or to a family, and that design, those patterns really reinforce that like there's so much of this world that we have shaped to tear apart and not reinforce and not to create coherence. But once you start to see those patterns and how enlivening it can be whenever you're playing with those elements and you're putting them together, then it becomes so much more of a rich tapestry, and you can start to see that there's holes within holes. And so from here, Joe, I'm curious how this really shows up in your work with Permarchitecture. Why create your own firm, or what's the story to go into incorporating a new firm, a new name, and really doing things quite different? What enabled you, or why take that leap? Because that seems like a bit of a leap.
It was a gradual leap, honestly, because I had my dad with me, and I learned the art. I learned the dark art of screen sharing virtual work with him, because I was still working with and for him when I had started traveling. And so whenever he'd need me, we'd hop on Zoom and work remotely. And so I was Zooming before it was cool to Zoom. And I, try to incorporate that into working with clients early on, with more or less success before COVID, I'll have to admit. But there were a lot of very nice experiments. The old Permarchitecture website was geared towards individual homeowners and home builders and self-builders, particularly, people who want to take on the project and do it themselves, and they need that hand to guide them and to talk things out with. And it gradually morphed into more of a consultancy business with bigger project, because the projects got bigger and bigger. Usually in the what used to be the eco-village space, and now is more co-housing and regenerative neighborhoods, transitional neighborhoods here in Europe as well. So the work got administratively more complicated, because there's always budgets and quarterlies and reports, and it's sometimes hard to translate the process that I'm trying to build into projects like this, development projects. So it's a work in progress, I'll say. And if anybody has tips, I'm all ears.
What does the process look like for the types of projects that you're doing? Where do you start, and then how do you end up with a finished product?
We always start by looking at the basic elements of a land, the 4 elements: earth, wind, and fire, and water. How do they impact the sites that you have? And it doesn't necessarily have to be an empty site, an empty plot of land. Wherever you're starting from is the place that you're starting from. The process is trying to do is figure out the place as a whole system, and then envision how we can make that better and define what that better is.
So how do you define place? What is it, the boundaries of the property, or do you see place differently than that?
Well, you mentioned whole and whole, and a lot of times eco-villages, for example, tend to buy a plot of land and turn into themselves. Like they got their slice of paradise and they're gonna build something isolate. They're gonna play by themselves over there in that place, in that plot of land. And of course, it doesn't work like that. Nature doesn't work like that. So the first step is understanding that you're part of a watershed. You depend on the way the water flows from up the hill towards your land, and then the people below you depend on how the water has passed through your land. And so already it opens up, it zooms out your what is place, what is here definition.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you relate to the neighbors, to the neighboring places, is another question that you can start with. And one thing I love to do is interview people from the area, especially elders. If you can find yourself an elder, you're like found gold. They're chatty as well, usually. So they're going to tell you everything. And you can ask them stuff like, how did water change throughout the years? How was it here when you were young? How do people build houses here? There was this, for example, in somewhere other in France, south of France, but not quite here. They have whole facades with slate, big sheets of slate stuck to the walls of the houses. Not all of them, but there seems to be a pattern to it. And finally, I found someone after months and months of living there, and found out that the winds in a particular time of the year come from the east, and that east-facing facades are always, here in this particular valley, have a good old windbreak in form of a slate sheet.
That's so cool. That's amazing. So you really helped to define place, and I cut you off there. So please do keep going on the process work that you're talking about.
Yeah, and so a sort of deliverable that you can have throughout all this process is a permaculture type sector map, or an adapted version of it. A sector map is a sort of pie chart of elements that are influences on your site, and a placement of those sectors on the map of the plan, on the plan of your site. And you can also do zoning maps and whatever other maps and layers of information that you can find, right? It's a process of slowness, of taking time to be curious. And what is really interesting about it is that the more you slow down and the more curious you are, the more interesting stuff you discover about a place. How the water goes is one very good example, and it can be very, very, very useful, for example, in informing you that there's a puddle in the winter right over there, and that's exactly where you had thought that you wanted to build. And if you take we've taken the time to read that land and realize there's a puddle, like very straightforward. The answer is move your house from there, don't build it there. And it's usually what people would do is we just make a concrete slab, we drain that place, and whatever, it rains, it puddles, we're on a concrete slab, right? It's this imposing of our will on nature that's been working fairly well until now. But we're sort of reaching a point where we realize we have to work with nature, and we can be smart about it. And talking about that reminds us of the fact that nature can also be very angry at times. And it's something that we don't really like to think about. And even architects, we really like to envision the beautiful future with the beautiful project that we're building there. But climate adaptation and climate mitigation are really becoming to be another layer on top of the way we're thinking about a place. How is that place becoming? Is it prone to floods? Is it prone to fires? Is it prone to droughts, to heat waves? And how does that place that you're thinking of building, of making, taking that into consideration?
Yeah, we have to dig into that. How do you start to adapt? I mean, are you thinking more of the physical structure whenever you're thinking about the bioclimatic changes? Are you thinking about the systems that support the structure? Or are you thinking more of the landscape around the house or the building or whatever, or the village or whatever it is that you're working on?
Well, of course, I'm thinking of all of them.
I think I set you up for that one. But yeah, I am so curious about how we're living through this time of, I think it's easy to say uncertainty, that we can't predict the future based upon the past.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's just different conditions. So how does that start to inform our design thinking whenever we're not really sure what's in store for us?
Yeah. And I feel that complexity thinking mindset is very helpful in that, because once you realize that the context is infinite, there is no way you're going to understand it all and put it inside boxes and Excel sheets. Once you gear away from that, you can take uncertainty in and sort of dance, adapt. And uncertainty is really scary. It's really, really scary, especially, when you're trying to build walls, you're trying to make stuff that lasts for a long time.
Mm.
Before we get back into this episode, I want to share an exciting announcement about a very special opportunity to gather with some of the country's most innovative and pioneering professionals that are helping to grow the field of regenerative real estate. At the end of this summer, we are hosting the second annual Regenerative Real Estate Gathering that will be held outside of Portland, Maine at the Riverbend Farm. This year, our theme is from ownership to stewardship. And not only will attendees get a chance to hear from incredible speakers and organizations doing work around ecological resilience, inclusive real estate development, regenerative design, and advanced sustainable practices, but it is also an opportunity to connect, unwind, and play. This is an opportunity to nurture your spirit, to get inspired, and to connect with incredible people in a unique place that comes with certified living buildings, delicious organic feasts from the farm on site, swims in the rejuvenating Saco River, and activities like yoga and dance. Last year, we were blown away by the wide array of people from developers, architects, investors, planners, realtors, and earth stewards. To find out more about this special gathering, you can find the link in our show notes or go to our website at chooselatitude.com/gathering. I hope to see you there.
What I'm curious about is if it goes back to like this fascination with how to design and also understanding the context of if you're working in a completely different place than where your clients are. And you're saying time is such a necessary element to really get to know that place and the site and the conditions. How do you design for that? Or how do you work with that place and with those clients? Whenever it's usually, here's our schedule, here's when we're trying to finish this by, and you get the keys and the certificate of occupancy. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, well, it is a challenge. I'll tell you that. It's also empowering when it helps individuals who are doing their own thing. So when it's smaller projects and I get to help empower people and we do it together, it's really rewarding. When you get to bigger scale projects, there's always, like a couple of months ago, we had this site assessment that we did for a small community that was setting up with reversible habitats, and the timeline was made and the budgets were put, and the site analysis was built into that budget. Like that was fine. But then they wanted to make a timeline, and also they wanted to speed things up so fast that most of the elements of, listening, understanding, diagnosing would have had to be done in like 4 weeks. No, wait, we can't do it in 4 weeks. We need more time. And it was sort of always this same discussion of explaining a sort of spiraled, complex process of understanding and listening and thinking things through to this very paced and linear administrative work that just they're willing to help you, but they need to have their schedules done and their reports and everything. And that's always the main issue in communicating. And I'm sure I'm speaking to a lot of hearts when I'm saying this, whatever the profession.
Well, what it makes me think of is this morning I was working with a real estate agent as I'm selling a piece of land in a different state. And the buyer of the property wants to close whenever they get their permit for what they want to build on the site. And that's really hard for me because that pushes things out a really long time. And I'm over here as like the thinking brain of negotiating. Well, no, I want as short of a window as possible to not tie the closing of the property to you getting your permit, which means that they have to submit architectural plans to the municipality to grant the permit. And it's just making me realize not only have I really set this up as counter to what you're talking about, but the buyers of this property are also setting themselves up to just rushing through this process where they're going to be building a home and really not spending very much time at the site at all. And just at this one particular point of the year when it's like the seasons are so different there that it almost makes me cringe thinking like I'm making them speed up this design process. When in reality, I really want them to close on the property and then spend a year going and like sitting with the land and seeing what it can be. But I just, that is just one example that happened this morning that has been replicated in my career hundreds of times.
Yeah. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've had people come to me in the middle of an ongoing project asking for, a nice to have adage to their project in the shape of the, say, land assessment or bioclimatic analysis or okay, we have the project. How do we make it sustainable? I love this one because it's an additive process, not the other way around. One of the main pillars of sustainable architecture is the knowledge that the most carbon saved is by building less and building smarter, meaning building more adaptable, making programs that are more adaptable to changes. An architectural program is the list of features that you need in an architectural project. And usually it's an additive list. Like we go this and this and that and that and that. And we make this whole enormous list of stuff. And we build this whole enormous, squares and square feet of construction. And then we say, okay, now let's make it sustainable. And this is where I come in, and it's so easy to put green roofs and solar panels and on an existing building. But if you zoom out a bit, slow down, you can see there's so much more you can do by thinking it through before you even, put your hand on a pen and draw things out.
What I think where my mind goes is like it's such a privilege to be able to work with a piece of land that you're creating for the first time, and you can really work to nest the building onto the site and in the right context that work with the elements and work with the contours and things like that. But there's also so many people that you're having to work with the constraints of an existing structure that is on the property. What do you err more towards new construction, or do you work a lot with renovations?
Well, in during last year's heat wave, I came up with a side project that is called Dr. House. It's like telemedicine, but for your house. And the basic point of it was that there are always passive cooling and heating strategies that you can take and adapt your existing house to the environment as it is now. And it also begins with listening to your place, to understanding how your house works and how you can incorporate, for example, cross ventilation if you need that, or better insulation if you need that, the sun catchment, etc. And there isn't one solution, because if there was one solution that we could all, make and that was it would have been much more easy. But every bioregion is different, every microclimate is different, and every single place is going to have a different weather, a different combination of the basic elements. And so an existing house starts from the same questions.
But you have a program around Listen to Your Land. Tell me about the ebook, the Listen to Your Land, and how people can engage with that. Like, what are the resources that you're able to provide them to go down this path?
I wrote an ebook that is online for free that is called, incidentally, Listen to Your Land. And that is basically a guidebook. It also has a checklist for visiting the site. It was done a couple of years ago, and the question that I was trying to solve was, how do you better place a house on a piece of land? And it takes a lot of bioclimatic and permaculture elements in doing that. Recently, my thinking and my practice has been growing, and so I'm currently in the process of developing Listen to Your Land 2.0, which would ultimately be a guidebook for community builders and developers and dreamers of new places, to be able to take it step by step and understand the place where they want to make better. And so zooming out and taking in even more information about that place, so gearing towards the social, the economic, the political, even though I will need help for those elements, because it's really not my forte. So hopefully there'll be a lot of interviewing of people on the ground who are designing and dreaming up places, and understanding their process and how they listen to your land, because I'm not the only one doing that. But yeah, trying to build it up, to make a structure out of it, a coherent method that people can use.
So you've been a contributor to the Carbon Almanac, if I'm correct, that Seth Godin put out. What's the story there?
Oh, it starts from architecture, actually. So I had the bright idea, like all of our generation, that if you have a business, you have to have a blog, a marketing blog. And I started writing about and explaining to people why they should hire me. And I quickly burned out. And it slowly became Joe's Epistolary, which is my Substack right now, which is not a marketing tool whatsoever, but it's really fun. And that's where you can find a Listen to Your Land ebook as well. But in this process of trying to market myself, I came in contact with the Seth Godin's work and world, and I somehow got very lucky and ended up in this beautiful network of people. And the co-creation process was magical. There were people from all over the world, all time zones, all remote, on a discourse channel, pouring their hearts into a same project in a very short amount of time. And the book was out, and it's now published at Penguin. It's a #1 Amazon bestseller on its category. And there are a lot of tiny side projects and, spreadings that are happening. One of them being very, very similar to our systems thinking approach that we've been talking about, which is connecting the carbon dots. It's a graph that takes the linear elements of the book, the solutions, the issues and the solutions, and weaves them together in a system, in a graph of interrelationships. And I like to quote John Muir on that when he says that when you try to pull a thread, you find it hitched on all of the universe. Mm. And it is all connected. And so that's a visual representation of this interconnectedness.
For those people that aren't familiar with the Carbon Almanac, can you give a rundown of what that is?
The Carbon Almanac is a collective volunteer-based project that aims to put the facts on climate change on the table and spark discussion, because there isn't enough talk about climate change, because it's scary, because it's inconvenient. And even though it focuses on something very specific, as our carbon emissions as a society, it weaves into a whole global wave of people showing up and trying to do better. And this showing up is everyone can do it. We've been sort of waiting for experts to help us out and take the reins and do it for us. And while we just sit back, relax, and watch Netflix. And it's us. It's us who have to do it. We just show up and we do it. And so it's the Carbon Almanac's aim is inspiring people to act, to take one thing that they care about and just run with it. Whether it's at the level of your local community, of your kids' kindergarten, of saving a watershed, your watershed from pollution, just pick one thing and just run with it and show up.
Along that same line, how do you think that people can show up at home with their own place? How can they start that journey?
Very good question, and it segues very nicely into the whole philosophy around listen to your land. That the way we build our homes is a mirror of our perceived relationship with nature. And our homes today are sort of an embodiment of separation. And so my first step would be to find nature, to search for it, search for the elements. Where does the sun rise and fall? How does that affect the quality of light in your place? Small, tiny curiosities. How does the wind blow? And then zoom out from your house to your garden, from your garden to your neighborhood, to your watershed, to your whole ecoregion, and just be curious about that. And the more we connect back with nature, the more likely we are to save it, is my motto. And
Do you-
hope.
and I think it's real easy to find that nature in a more remote place, but imagine you were in Paris. Do you think that what do you tell people that are coming from metropolitan areas like that?
Yeah, well, I was reading just 2 weeks ago in Architecture d'aujourd'hui, which is an architecture magazine, about biodiversity of cities and empty plots of land in the city. And it seems that cities have their own biodiversity, they have their own species and their own way. They interact in a specific way that is different from the outside. I think that's absolutely beautiful. But it is a very hard question of how do you find nature again in cities, because so many people live in cities and so many people spend most of their time inside. And biophilic design is one way to tackle this. Biophilic design stems from the idea that we have an innate love of nature and that we feel better when we are in contact with nature, and so tries to bring patterns and elements of nature into the built environment so that it reconnects us with this part of ourselves. And that's always a good start. And there are cities that are trying to reconnect with nature and bring biophilic design in nature, bioclimatic as well. Paris just launched their local urbanism plan as a bioclimatic urbanism plan in an attempt to tackle climate change issues of overheating and stormwater management in the city by understanding the way nature works. So there's always, there are always steps. Start small as well is a very good one.
Yeah, certainly. I was just reading a book called Urban Jungle, but it had this really interesting statistics that there's more biodiversity within a city than there is in more wild areas. And that because it's these two ecosystems
Boundaries.
having the boundaries and the edge effect of just the interesting thing that takes place between even agricultural or forest land and suburban lands, and like the species that carve out their niches there. And it's really interesting to think like, the city, and this is where I'm not so sure I followed this same philosophy that the city is nature. It's just a human sculpted nature. It seems a bit more of like a synthetic nature, but I do keep thinking that, like, beneath that concrete and the pavement, there's so much potential that's held there, and we're still dealing with energy and nutrients and light and water and circularity, and I'm saying circularity over waste. Was how do we start to really rethink what we're doing in our metropolitan areas? But I think it's amazing that you've taken such a bold step forward to combine the natural world and the permaculture systems thinking approach with an architectural practice. Where do you work? What I think that's a good kind of segue out to put a chapter end on this conversation of who are the clients that you work with, and where do they live? Or is this a European context, or do you work further afield?
I work with the European and US, mainly because of time zones. So I have very long afternoons talking to the US. It has been a lot of eco-village and community building. And I'm now trying to find my way towards community land trust, co-housing, and all these sorts of new, beautiful ways of building, of being together.
There's like such a surge of interest around that as well. I'm not sure if you found that, but it sounds like you're finding that of people more and more attuning towards community, and especially with community land trusts, of how do we do this where people can have access.
Yeah. And there's always the issue of governance, and governance, meaning how do we decide of stuff together? How do we live together? Is also a question here. And it's a very hard and important and profound one that can translate into architecture. And because the way you place buildings next to one another shapes the way they interact, and the way the houses interact, the buildings interact, shapes the way humans interact. And so there's this whole potential of making places better that make people better, that make places better, and it goes on and on and on. It's fantastic, and I think we are ripe for that path. We're there. We can do it. We just have to slowly get rid of the whole administrative burden and reports and ways that we do things. Just a little bit, unshackle them just a little bit, enough to give way to magic. This is a message that goes out to all of the urban planners out there.
And let's just change our zoning codes, and we'll be on a good path to start to do that. Joe, where can people learn more about what you're doing right now?
My website is at permarchitecture.net, and I also publish twice monthly an illustrated audio video piece on joepetroni.substack.com, which is my blog with Joe's Epistolary of Imaginary Friends. I write letters to imaginary friends.
Oh, I can't wait to get into that. I subscribed before we got onto the show, and we'll certainly link to that into our show notes. But Joe, this has been a real pleasure, and I can't wait to reconnect with you and to have you back.
Likewise, Neil. It's lovely chatting with you.
If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows, maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.